Hello and welcome to Everything iPad. This is a brand new podcast from me. My name's Matt and I run a tech channel called Buzzkill Tech, and for many years I've been uploading loads of tutorials and iPad apps and just general stuff to help you make the most out of the iPad that you have at home. And this is a new podcast where each episode I'm going to be exploring different things, different apps, different ideas, talking about software updates and all sorts of cool things, workflows, all that kind of stuff. That's what I'm going to be doing in this new podcast. And yes, this podcast is going to be available on YouTube, so you can watch this and you'll be able to listen to it basically everywhere else. So welcome if you're watching and listening wherever you are. And in this episode, I'm going to start with a topic that's really close to my heart, and that is making music. And today I'm going to be taking a look at Logic Pro on the iPad, and that was released earlier this week. And I'll be honest with you, this is something I've been waiting for a very long time. I've been making music and recording audio on the iPad for a very long time. I've used lots of different apps. I've used Core Gadget in the past. I've mainly used Cubase or Cubasis from Steinberg, which up until this point probably was the best fit for audio recording on the iPad. That changed this week when Apple finally released Logic Pro and Final Cut for the iPad. We've been waiting for a very long time, and lots of people, when you look online, lots of the reviews, all the tech reviewers and so on, are focusing on Final Cut, and that's fine. But I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with Logic because it's something that's I've been looking forward to from the moment they announced it. I was waiting for the however many weeks it was, and I'm really pleased to finally be able to use it. And in this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about some things you may not know, just about getting up and running, some of the key differences between this and the desktop version. It's not going to be a comprehensive review because I've been using it for barely a week, and that will probably come a bit further down the line. But I'm going to be looking at those kind of key features and the stuff I like, the stuff I really like, because there's some really good things here, and some stuff that I think is missing. And I think it's going to be really interesting. So if you're into any kind of audio or music, that kind of the audio creative side of using an iPad, then check out this episode because hopefully you're going to find it really useful. So if you're watching, you'll be able to see my screen along. If you're not, then that's too bad, but I'll do my best to describe everything that I'm doing as I'm going along. So what I have open in front of me is a copy of Logic Pro on the iPad, and if you want to get it, you will need to pay a £5 a month or $5 a month or whatever, wherever you are, subscription. You do get a month free trial, so that's quite good. So it lets you sort of decide if this is the right app for you, because this app might not necessarily be for everybody. Lots of people who are making music using Logic or whatever may look at this and be really interested in it. It might not necessarily fit into your workflow, so that month trial I think is definitely something to take a look at to see how this kind of fits into your audio production workflow. What you will need, aside from paying for that subscription, is an iPad capable of running it. Now, unlike Final Cut Pro, which is limited to the M series processors, this Logic Pro app can run on anything from an A12 chip upwards. So that includes the iPad Mini 5, I've got my list here, iPad Mini 5, the iPad Air 3rd generation, the 8th gen iPad, and the 2018 iPad Pro. That iPad Pro is coming up for 5 years old. And that's going to run it, which is really, really good. So quite a broad range of modern iPads can run this, and I'd be really interested to see what Logic looks like on an iPad Mini, because I'm using a 12.9-inch iPad Pro here, and I can't imagine using Logic on anything smaller. I'm not going to lie. I think it's going to be quite cramped on anything else. The good news is lots of the windows and interfaces can sort of be hidden away, a bit like on the desktop version, so that will help you kind of get by. So they're the specs that you need to run this software, so hopefully this is something that you'll be able to run if you have an iPad at home. And let's talk about a few things that I think are really interesting about using Logic on the iPad. And firstly, let's talk about iCloud. And when you install Logic on your iPad, it will create a Logic Pro for iPad folder on your iCloud drive. This is really good because synchronization happens really quick. So I've created some projects on the desktop version of Logic Pro, and I've been able to put it in that same folder, and the synchronization has worked really well. In fact, if you're working with sort of MIDI based audio projects, that audio syncs straight away. It's fantastic. If you're working with audio, it takes a bit longer. You have to wait for it to sort of download and re-upload and so on. But it's a completely doable workflow as long as your file's not completely huge. So the idea of synchronizing, it feels quite fluid. It feels quite smooth. So that's something that's really impressed me. And it sort of opens up, I think, the possibilities of collaboration. If you set up a shared iCloud drive folder and you have your Logic Pro files in there, then that's something that you can share with other people and you can work on projects collaboratively. There are caveats to that, and that's mainly around third-party plugin support, which I'm going to come to a bit later on this episode because you're very limited on that front. Another thing is it will open GarageBand iOS projects. So the way that works is when you open up something you've worked on in GarageBand before, a dialog comes up, and what it's going to do is duplicate that file and convert it from a GarageBand iOS file to Logic Pro. So if you've got loads of projects that you've been using GarageBand for on the iPad, they're going to open absolutely fine on this Logic Pro thing. So that's going to be a really smooth transition for you. So let's take a look at the iPad, the app, the interface and everything about it. And I've been using this for several days now. And what strikes me about Logic on the iPad is that you can really tell it's made for a touch interface. If you are hoping to use Logic with a magic keyboard or a trackpad or something like that, it's completely doable. But aspects of it feel quite clunky in comparison to the desktop version, because, and rightly so, I think that this version of Logic is made for touchscreen, and the touch implementation is actually really impressive, along with support for the Apple Pencil, which I think is actually really important because you can really make use of the Apple Pencil in a different way. It's not just for artists and illustrators. Actually, there's lots of really cool things that you can do with the touch interface and an Apple Pencil. What I really like is I've got an M2 iPad Pro here which supports the hover feature, so you just hover above any of the buttons on the transport or the top or anything like that, and you'll be able to sort of get a preview of what you're about to touch. But where the Magic Pencil really comes into its own is with things like automation. And when you open up the automation section of this, you can use your Apple Pencil to basically draw in the automation that you want. And when you look along the top of the app, you have a number of different tools. It's a bit like a drawing app in some ways. You have a pencil tool and a brush tool. And there's this pencil tool that you can use. You can actually draw in dots where you want automation to occur and drag them and move them around and stuff like that. And what you're able to do using the brush tool is just simply swipe across the screen to draw in your automation however you want it. And then there's another button where you can adjust the curve of the lines. And using the Apple Pencil and automation on the iPad is something that's really beneficial. And I actually think that's one of the things that the iPad version of the app does better than the desktop version. That real tight control over automation and drawing stuff in. I think that's something that's really quite successful, I think. There are things you have to get used to when using a touch interface. The idea of moving a region around is a bit of a strange one, I think, because when you're swiping along a window around the screen, all you're doing is moving around the project. So if you want to select a bunch of regions, you have to hold down your finger, and then you'll have the equivalent of clicking on a mouse and dragging to draw a square, and that's how you'll sort of select multiple regions. Moving stuff around feels a bit weird. It doesn't feel quite as smooth as the desktop version, but it's a workflow thing. It's something you have to kind of get used to. They've implemented a number of buttons that allow you to duplicate regions or make use of time stretch or to loop things as well. So they're all along the top, and that feels quite useful to have. They've put it in a very prominent place on the screen, which means that you sort of easily find it when you're not using a trackpad or a mouse or something like that. So overall, I really feel quite strongly that Apple have made the right decision in making this a touch-based workstation, as opposed to just solely relying on a trackpad and things. I think they've done the right choice here because, I don't know, personally for me, when I'm making music, I don't want to be just clicking stuff with a mouse and dragging dials and moving stuff around just using a mouse and a cursor. I like the mixing process to feel like you're working with an instrument, and I want to touch what's happening on the screen. I want to turn a dial, I want to point at something and move it, and that feels a much more realistic approach to making music, and it certainly feels good, I have to say, using this kind of workflow. So I'm really pleased that Apple have made this choice in going for a touch-based interface first. As I say, you can absolutely use a trackpad with it. It will work just fine, but if you're using a trackpad, don't expect it to feel like Logic on a desktop, because it won't. Things are in different places. It feels kind of weird. It's not quite as responsive. If you use a mouse on a desktop version and a mouse on the iPad version, the desktop version will win. Because everything's much more clicky, responsive, immediate, it happens, whereas that's just not the way the iPad works. Now, to get you going, one of the things I do like is there's loads and loads of tutorials. When you open up the screen for the first time, but also when you go to add a new project, you can see that there's loads of tutorials to help you get going. And they cover the basics, which I think is really impressive in terms of just getting you up and running. Because, if you're a seasoned Logic Pro user, I mean, I've been using Logic for nearly 20 years. I'm old enough to remember the days of eMagic Logic, I'm afraid. When you switch over from the desktop version to the iPad version, the workflow's different, stuff's in different places, and there is a learning curve. So even if you're a seasoned Logic Pro user, you need to make sure that you're looking at the tutorials that are available. They cover the basics like, recording MIDI and adding loops and creating regions, blah, blah, blah. It's stuff you know how to do on the desktop, but I would still go through it because, as I said, lots of things are in different places. There are cool new features. Beat Breaker is something that I really like. That's completely new to Logic, and you definitely want to check out the tutorials for that one, because that is a really cool kind of effect plugin that you can add to just really kind of mix things up. That's all I'll say, but it's definitely worth having a go at that one. So I personally found the tutorials really good, and they are interactive tutorials, so it's just text-based, and it talks you through where to tap, where to move stuff, and it gets you learning by doing, which is one of the things that you need to make sure that you do. Now, one of the things you'll definitely want to do is to make some customizations to the toolbar. Now, if you are used to working with Logic on a Mac, then you probably would have customized your own toolbar at some point, and this is doable to an extent on the iPad. And if you tap the three dots in the top right corner and choose Customize Control Bar, you can toggle on or off different buttons that might be missing, like capture, recording, rewind, fast forward. The one I use is when you're using Logic and you have the beat at the top, you can get it to show beat and time. I usually like to see what bar number I'm on or what beat of that bar, but I also like to know how long the track is I'm working, so I usually get it to display the time. So that's all there, and you can show whether or not, if you've got a MIDI controller connected, when you press C and it displays at the top, you can turn that on. And there's all sorts of things you can turn on and off. So it's worth going through when you're starting to use Logic, just going and finding that and customizing your experience a little bit more. So that resembles a bit more your desktop workflow for this. So just to remind you, if you tap the three dots in the top right corner and choose Customize Control Bar, that is how you'll get to that. And that's something you want to do kind of almost straight away, I think. So earlier I mentioned that, the iPad Pro, Logic, really good tool for collaboration or working, taking desktop projects and bringing them to the iPad and sending them back. And that does work. But one feature that is limited at the moment, and I suspect is going to be limited for quite some time, is third-party plugin support. Now, this is going to be a tricky issue, and if you're someone who's going to be absolutely determined to take desktop Logic files and bring them to the iPad, and you're someone who's used to, using lots of third-party plugins, then you're going to need to use Bounce in Place quite a lot to transport your different files between the desktop and the iPad. Because when you attempt to open up something that doesn't support the third-party plugin, you'll get an error to say that that plugin's not available on the iPads. You need to either install the extension, or you're going to have to find a different sound or a different plugin to use in its place. Now, I've tried a plugin that I have on both the iPad and the Mac. This is IK Multimedia's Syntronic 2. Now, I have both on it, and it's curious that Syntronic 2 doesn't actually open. I suspect because a very specific type of plugin is required if you want that cross compatibility, which is AUV3, Audio Unit version 3. And I suspect that my version of Syntronic isn't AUV3 compatible. And what you'll need to do is basically not use that, or if you're using a third-party plugin, as I said before, Bounce in Place. There are a limited amount of plugins available whereby you can have them on the iPad and have them on the desktop versions of Logic, and they'll work seamlessly. And Moog actually have a series of different apps available. They've got the Model D, the Model 15, and the Animoog Z or Z, depending on what part of the world you're from. And last night I created just a very short 8-bar loop in Logic on the desktop of different Moog synthesizers. So I've got the Model D, the Model 15, and the Animoog, and I just created an 8-bar loop on the desktop. And I wanted to see if that would open on the iPad. And I synced it with my iCloud, and I opened it up, and it worked instantly. Like, all the third-party plugins were there. And the reason this works is because these plugins were actually designed on the iPad first, these AUV3 plugins, but then they brought them to the Mac App Store. So there are plugins available that you can use that will work seamlessly across both, but there aren't that many. I'm someone who uses Waves. I'm someone who uses Native Instruments. I use Native Instruments a lot, actually. Those Waves and Native Instruments, they don't have anything on the iPad. They're not AUV3. So if I try to open up a project, I'm just going to be greeted with error messages telling me that plugin's not available on the iPad. That's going to be a bit annoying if you're someone who uses a lot of third-party plugins. There's two ways around this. One is that you switch and you just use the stock Logic stuff or whatever is available on the app stores that support AUV3 on both the iPad and the Mac. That's probably not the best option. So if you are determined, what you'll need to do on the desktop version of Logic is to bounce in place all of the audio. So your audio is captured with any third-party instruments or virtual instruments you're using, as well as any plugins that you're using. That's really limiting, and that is going to be a big issue for many people when they're trying to incorporate Logic Pro into their workflow. That's going to be something that's going to be quite difficult to kind of figure out. Yeah, good luck with that one. Another thing that has struck me, and something that I really miss, I don't want to be one of these people that moans about the headphone jack, but I do miss it in this case. There's one USB-C port on my iPad Pro, and I need to plug in my headphones into that via an adapter. Then if I want to use a MIDI controller, I can't, because my one port's been taken up by my headphones. Now you can get like dongles and hubs or whatever, but at what point are you turning your iPad into a Mac, a laptop? The purpose of the iPad is it's just that one thing you're having, and you don't want loads of dongles and wires coming out of it. I'd like to be able to plug in two things. I would like to be able to plug in a USB MIDI controller or an audio interface and have headphones at the same time. That's quite an annoyance. And what I can only hope is that maybe one day Apple will bring back the headphone socket. What am I saying? Maybe one day they'll bring it back. Fingers crossed. Maybe they'll do what they did on the MacBook Pros and the Mac Studio, which I have here. They put a high impedance headphone jack on it. I don't know how much power that draws or uses, but if we're talking like pro level audio, I think having a high impedance headphone jack on this would be a really, really good move. Failing that, a second USB-C port would be awesome. I'm going to be really honest. I've mentioned my scenario where I actually was sitting on my armchair and I wanted to record in some MIDI on a keyboard, but I have to choose between listening on headphones or recording on a keyboard. But I haven't even factored in charging the iPad at the same time. So that's a big hardware limitation. I think that the speakers on the iPad Pro are good, but they're not. I'm not mixing audio with them. That's not really going to be good enough for me. So that's just something I suppose to bear in mind in your workflow, and it's something that I hope Apple, they could easily address this. Just give me the headphone jack. Just please. I know it happened years ago, and I sound like a 2016 YouTuber, but I think at this point I need something here to go. Please don't make me buy a Bluetooth MIDI keyboard. Please don't do it, Apple. Talking of inputting sounds and instruments, in the bottom right corner of the app you have this sort of keyboard diagram. There's this touch interface that you have whereby you can notes use with touch, and it resembles GarageBand, and it resembles Logic Remote, where you've got different types of surfaces that you can choose from. So you can do drum pads, a fretboard, chord strips, guitar strips. You can set the scales and things like that. So you can set it to D Mixolydian if you wanted to, or E flat minor, or whatever you want to do. You can set that, and it's quite good. But if you've got thin fingers, then it works for you. But when I'm trying to play a chord on a touch interface like this, it just doesn't work for me. Hence the fact that I want a MIDI controller hooked up to this. I'll be honest, most of the time. But it's a nice thing to have if you just want to put in a few quick notes. I think that can be kind of quite useful. Let's talk about another thing that I noticed when using Logic Pro this week, and that is the mixer. The mixer's pretty good, actually. You've got all your features. You can still use your plugins, and you've got your faders, and you can even use the mixer in portrait mode on the iPad, which can be quite helpful if you want to see sort of more of the strip. If you've got lots of plugins and things, that can be really useful. But one thing that annoys me about the mixer on Logic Pro for the iPad at the moment is that I can't add plugins. So, I'm sitting here right now and I'm looking at my screen of a Logic project, and I've got all my tracks here. But if I want to add another plugin to one of my instruments, what I have to do is choose the track and then click another button, which is sort of next to it at the bottom, which allows me to add in more effects plugins. So I can't do it via the mixer. That's not like the desktop version. I hope that's something they update. If there's one thing I want Apple to update, this would be one of them. Actually, there's two things which I'm going to come to in a minute. But one of the things I'd love them to do is be able to go into Mixer View and be able to just tap a plus icon on each of my channel strips to add a new plugin, a new effect, or whatever it is I want to do, because that's the way I'm used to working. And I'm really surprised they missed this off. It's something that I really do hope they add. I think that would make quite a big difference. The second thing, so I said there were kind of two things that I feel like are missing from Logic Pro on the iPad. We still have our global tracks, which is found at the top, and it lets you draw in things like tempo changes, and you can add in, I forgot what else you can add in actually. You can add in new time signatures and things, key signatures. One thing that's missing from this is arrangement. Arrangement is something that I use a lot in Logic Pro on the desktop, and it functions quite similar to markers in that you have a section of music on Logic, and what you can do is you can label that section, call it intro or verse or chorus. But what I really like about the arrangement tool in Logic is that I can move sections around, and if I just drag the section header at the top, it just rearranges the order of my music, or I can use that to duplicate sections, particularly if I'm working on a song. It's really quick and easy, and you can extend a song within seconds. This is missing from the Logic on the iPad, which is something I really hope they do bring back to this app as well, because that is one of the first things I looked for. I noticed it was missing, and that was a bit disappointing. Yeah. But what I am pleased to see, though, because I'm going to stay positive here, that's what I want to do, is the fact that you can have different time signatures, set different keys, adjust the tempo, all things that have kind of been missing from iPad DAWs. I mean, Cubasis, which is the one that I said earlier was closest to a desktop experience. You are really limited in terms of time signatures and the ability. You couldn't even change, well, last time I checked, you couldn't even change the time signature mid-piece if you wanted to. So I think they've done well to bring a lot of those features. So Global Tracks is more or less complete, but it is missing the arrangement, and that's something that kind of bugs me quite a lot. And another difference I noticed when we're comparing the Mac and the iPad version is the sound library. There's quite a big difference in what's available. When you open up Logic, there's loads of sound packs and stuff, loops and all sorts of things that you can have a look at and download. And I downloaded all of it. Now on the iPad, if you download all of the sound packs, it comes to 15.35 gigabytes. If I download all the sound packs on Logic for the desktop, it comes to like 70 or 80 gigabytes. So what's the difference here? Like, what am I missing? And I was trying to work this out, and there are lots of, there's certainly a lot of presets missing. When I load up Alchemy, for instance, on the iPad, and I compare it to what's available on the desktop version, there's far fewer presets that I spotted anyway. So there's quite a few sort of sounds missing. Presumably they download somehow. I didn't have any problems opening up Logic Projects, which had the much bigger library on the iPad. They seem to be okay. But that's something I did notice. The difference in the file size for the libraries is huge. As I said, just over 15 gigabytes if you have all the sounds on the iPad. All the sounds on the desktop is 70 or 80 gigabytes. So I'm still trying to figure out what the big difference is there. It does feel like there's some stuff missing. So let's end this episode on a bit of a positive. And one of the things I want to talk about is one of the new plugins available, which is called Beat Breaker. This is something that's really cool, and you add it as an effect plugin on one of your instruments, and it allows you to add a sort of a time or volume based effects, sort of like remix effects in a way. And what it will do is you can do lots of different things with it. What it will do is it will chop up, or it will split, or segment. That's the best word to use. It will segment your audio into however many beats you want to have, and then what you can do with those beats, well, you can kind of mess around with it. So you could be specific beats that you have that you want to set to half time, or double time, or to reverse, which you can do. So it's almost like you're tweaking bits of the audio, specific beats of the audio that you've got. You can do some really cool, where I think this shines is some of the rhythmic effects you can do. So you're on a particular piece of audio, you can play back a specific beat or a couple of beats, but you can get it sounds sort of like a glitch effect. You can have these sort of triplets. It will just cut up the sound and loop it really quickly 3 or 4 times, so you get a sort of effect. That was a really good impression. And that's something that I've been playing around with, and I think that's kind of cool. I'm still in the early days of learning how to use it, but I think it's kind of a cool effect to have. It just adds something a little bit different, and it was kind of fun. The tutorial helps you get up and running with it to a basic level, but I think if you want to really learn how to do this is something you're going to have to play around with a lot more, or wait for some really good YouTubers to create some tutorials for you on how to use the beat breaker. But that is something that I thought was actually really cool. So in summary, I think Logic on the iPad is really successful. I think they've done a really good job in making it a touch interface. I think that works really well. I think that how it fits into your workflow is going to be up to you, and that's why that free trial is important. For me, when it comes to mixing, I tend to use the stock Logic plugins. So it's not going to be a massive issue for me to bounce any kind of third-party virtual instruments, bounce in places, WAV files, and then continue on my way, bring it to the iPad and mix there. And actually, I'm quite looking forward to mixing on the iPad. I think mixing on the iPad is going to be a real strength of this app. When I do mastering, I don't use Logic stock plugins. I use third party. So for me personally, I can't just use Logic on the iPad. But theoretically, can you create a beat from start to finish, mix and master it on the iPad version of Logic Pro? The answer is yes, you can. You absolutely can. Whether or not you want to, that's going to be down to you. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's a really interesting idea. I suspect lots of people are not going to do it because that range of third-party plugins just isn't available yet. I think it's going to be a long time before we see that range, unless Apple decides to buy out Waves or Native Instruments or whoever your favourite audio plugins are made by. So yeah, I think it will possibly fit into your workflow if you're willing to make some compromises. If you're willing to use bounce in place a lot, then they will absolutely work for you. If you're willing to forego some third-party plugins, then again, it can work for you. The other alternative, I suppose, is that you use Logic to start ideas, and then you take it to the desktop and you finish it there. That's also a possibility that I haven't really mentioned yet. Because there's lots of good sounds and lots of good things you can do. Create beats on the go. You can be in a hotel room and study inspiration strikes like they do on the Apple adverts. And you can start a beat, and then you might take it to a desktop later, which I think that's also what a lot of people might do. But there we are. What I'm hoping for going forward is that Apple, because we're moving to a subscription model, Apple will update Logic on a regular basis. The Mac version of Logic doesn't get updates that often. I'm hoping the iPad version does. There's some stuff missing, some simple interface things that I think could be added, and I don't see why it's not there. So hopefully it's something that arrives pretty soon. So that's it. That's the end of episode 1 of Everything iPad. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, get in touch. Go to youtube.com/@buzzkilltech to check out the channels. Loads of tutorials in there, stuff I've been teaching, everything from Microsoft Word all the way to DaVinci Resolve for iPad. It's all there. So get involved with that if you've not seen it already. But some of you will be watching this episode, so if you are, well, welcome back, and I hope this was enjoyable. Like, comment, subscribe, all that usual stuff. I am @Buzzkill on Twitter. The same on Mastodon, which is the one I use the most, Instagram, all that social media stuff. And if you want to make a donation, if you're on YouTube, you want to make a donation, there's a super thanks button. And for everyone else, there's a buyme.coffee link, buymeacoffee.com link. That's it. In the show notes, see if you want to make a donation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back probably next week with some reactions to the new iPad OS, which is going to be unveiled at WWDC next week. So looking forward to it. Thanks for listening and watching, and see you soon.